One of the last instances of leading from the front by European royal courts was that of Albert I, the King of Belgium. Albert was not initially meant to be king. He was actually third in line after King Leopold II's son, his cousin, and his older brother. However, both unfortunately passed away young, leaving Albert to fill the void. He ascended the throne December 3rd, 1909, after the death of Leopold II. He would rule until his death on February 17th, 1934. While this video is not going to cover a ton of his personal life growing up, I wanted to cover mainly what happened between the years of 1914 to the year 1918. As anyone who knows anything about the early 1910s, this is World War I, or the Great War, as it was known at the time. King Albert was as I mentioned, King of Belgium at the start of the war. Belgium has always had a strict neutral policy up to this point. They hadn't been independent from the Netherlands, Spain, France, any other country for too long by this point, less than 100 years. And they were not on the best of terms of really any country at the time. He was on speaking terms with Germany, as we'll see in a moment. However, he was on the best terms with what would become the Entente, either, as Belgium controlled portions of France or portions of land that were formerly French, leaving to a neutral stance pretty much among the entire royal court until after the war broke out. As I said, Belgium wanted to remain neutral in this conflict. However, two empires with expansionist ideas had just gone to war, and they were kind of stuck in the middle. King Albert had spoken with the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, who was the Emperor of Germany at the time, and pleaded with him for peace, pleaded with him not to go to war. However, by this point in time, it was too late. War was on the horizon, and Belgium was going to be stuck in the middle of it. On June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with his Duchess Sophia, were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. This sparked the Great War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, which then declared war back, which forced Germany to honor their military alliance with Austro-Hungarians, which then brought in France, which brought in England, and the conflict just continued to grow. I'll make an entire video on the Great War in its own time because that's going to be a mess to get into. So we'll stay out of the politics of that. All that really matters is France and Germany were at war. France and the Germans and the Franco-British. Stuck between them, as I said, was Belgium, on the northern edge of France and the western front of Germany. Now, to get to France, the Germans needed to go through Belgium. It was the easiest passageway through into the French countryside, and Belgium was holding their neutral stance. They wanted nothing to do with this war, and clearly did not want to fight. They didn't have the manpower, nor did they have the ideas to carry into an expansionist war. They had no part in this. On August 2nd, Germany issued an ultimatum: allow safe passage through Belgium into France or suffer destruction. They had 12 hours to respond. Albert flatly refused this. However, he did begin to strengthen his ties with the British Empire at this point. The next day, the king spoke to a packed parliament. If, however, it is necessary for us to resist the invasion of our soil, that duty will find us armed and ready to make the greatest sacrifices. This is the moment for action. I have faith in our destinies. A country which defends itself wins the respect of all. A country that defends itself wins the respect of all and cannot perish. God be with us in this just cause. Germany would invade the next day. Upon the German invasion of Belgium, the king immediately went to the front lines to command the roughly 220,000 troops that were under his control. This to combat the roughly 1 million soldiers that the Kaiser had committed to the war. Albert, however, was not just confined to his quarters. He was in the trenches, walking along the lines, speaking to soldiers, interacting with them while on duty, and giving encouragement, pep talks. He visited field hospitals speaking with wounded soldiers and giving them encouragement, as well as on one occasion even writing a letter for a soldier whose only desire was to write home. Now, I couldn't find any hard evidence that this actually happened, just some articles saying that it did. However, based on the characteristics this man gave, I like to believe it's true. While in the presence of their king, the morale among the Belgian army was high, very high. It boosted their strength immensely. They just couldn't hold back the sheer mass and size of the German army. Within 2 months, they were forced back, almost 95% of their land being lost to the Germans. And this began the famous Race to the Sea, a complicated series about flanking maneuvers of the Entente and the Central Powers, constantly trying to get around each other, working their way north until they reached the North Sea. Doubling down on his fierce neutrality stance, Albert refused to let his troops merge and integrate with the Entente regiments, stating that the only concern of the Belgian people is the independence of their country, and he did not want to be dragged into a wider conflict by allowing his troops to merge with the others. Oddly enough, in the research that I did for this, and the little bit that I do know of the Great War, Belgium wasn't fighting the same war that the Franco-British forces were. It just happened to be they were both fighting the Germans. The Germans were invading Belgium. The French were fighting, Franco-British were fighting in a alliance war. Sort of an enemy of my enemy is my friend, as they didn't have the best relation with the French either. Along the roots of alternate history, who's to say that the French wouldn't invade Belgium if the tables were turned, or even circumstances were slightly different? It just happened to be that the Germans invaded first. As both sides continued to outflank each other, working their way north, eventually they ran out of room. Backed into a corner with the sea on one side and the German army on the other. There was nothing but a small river standing between the two. Near the town of Ypres, Albert implemented a bold strategy. He decided to flood the river Isère from the town of Ypres all the way to the sea. This created a natural barrier between the two armies, holding the Germans at bay. Also, this backed them literally into a corner. The Belgians had nowhere to go from here, but that's all they needed to do, was to hold out against the Germans. They had no reason to fight otherwise. This flooding created a massive marsh, an area that it was impossible to get artillery through, or impossible to get still used cavalry, and it was a death sentence to try to cross on foot. The Belgians would dig in, and the Franco-British troops would move south, protecting the non-flooded lines, and they would reinforce those. And that's what they would do for the next 4 years, is they would hold their ground until 1918, not making any advances, not making any gains. However, the attrition was high. From the roughly 220,000 troops that Albert took command of at the start of the war, he had roughly 40,000, at least that's what's estimated. By the end of 1914, Albert had witnessed the invasion of his country almost totally, while leading from the front line, watched his own men die and nearly 50% of them be lost from the front line, and then ordered the flooding of his country's farmland. It was a rough year for him, and naturally his attitude towards the war began to sour. By this point, he had become convinced that even if the Entente pushed the Germans back, it would slowly devolve into the trench warfare that we know of World War I. And this would lay waste to vital farmlands of the Belgian lowlands, as well as many towns and villages, not even to begin to talk about the people themselves. This led him to believe that this war could not be won through strategic victory in battle, but through negotiations. He argued for what would essentially be a white peace, and nobody would really win or lose. It just would simply mean they'd stop killing each other. Using family connections, Albert's brother-in-law, and apologies for butchering this name, Hanwit Sutoring Jettenbach, who was a German diplomat, he attempted to learn what conditions Germany would restore peace and territorial boundaries, as well as full Belgian independence. He wasn't looking to sign a separate peace deal from the Franco-British or the rest of the Triple Entente, But if the terms were acceptable and it meant that Belgium would continue to stand free and independent, he was willing to take it. If he did take this deal, it would even take away the excuse or the reason that London and Paris were continuing to argue to fight Germany. It was to free the Belgians. Well, if the Belgians were no longer at war, maybe this would lead to a path for peace. His endeavors, unfortunately, would be fruitless, as disagreements on peace deals with the cabinet, as well as just unsatisfactory peace deals, would continue to sour these negotiations to the point that they were just cut off. This led King Albert to be increasingly pessimistic of the war, believing that if it just dragged on, all it would do would lead to more dead soldiers and civilians and pure destruction. And if they weren't careful, as we would later see in the war, it would lead to the eventual collapse of Western civilization as a whole, being we see the Russian Empire collapse into the Soviet Union. Failed peace negotiations aside, the Belgians held out in their little corner of their country near Dieppe for nearly 3 years. As the German lines began to crumble and Allied victory seemed more and more likely, Albert finally relented and would allow his troops to move out of the trenches and begin to retake ground. Of course, him leading the way. He would even allow his troops to eventually be integrated into a ragtag group of lowland regiments known as the Group Armies of Flanders, or the GAF. But not before rallying his troops with one final speech. Standing before his troops, he gave this speech. "It is your duty to drive back the invader, who has been oppressing your brethren for the last 4 years. The hour is decisive. The Germans are retiring everywhere. Soldiers, show yourselves worthy of the cause of our independence, worthy of our traditions, worthy of our race. Forward for right, for freedom, for glorious and immortal Belgium." Invigorated, the GAF relentlessly pushed the Germans, and in as little time as they lost the country, they had regained nearly all of their territory. Broken, battered, and defeated, the Germans eventually requested armistice, which would be granted and signed on November 11th of 1918. Peace, at last. 11 days after the signing of the armistice, the king, who led his soldiers from the front lines, who ruled from a small town by the sea, and had become a national hero, rode into the capital city of Brussels and began to rebuild. Albert was influential in a lot of ways. He did a lot of things leading through example, and from the front was his priority. Also a devout man of faith, and his entire family as well. He continued to pray for his troops and would regularly attend church services throughout the entire war. He would also lead the universal suffrage movement for men in Belgium, which would eventually be passed later on in his rule. He was a popular king. He was a national icon for many years. Unfortunately, his rule would be cut short in a mountaineering accident, as he would fall roughly 60 feet in purely an accident. Many people have suggested that this could have been an assassination attempt. However, forensics later showed it was simply an accident. He died on February 17th of 1934, and the entire country went into extensive grief, mourning the loss of their beloved king. He would be succeeded by his son, Leopold III, who will be another story for another day. When I began researching this video, I knew of King Albert and some of what he did, but the sheer tenacity that this man showed and the sheer amount of courage and refusal to give up was what really inspired me to continue making this into a longer video. This initially was going to be a 1.5 minute long short, and as you can see, I don't know what it's going to cut down to, but I'm at 41 minutes of recording right now. He deserved more time. He deserved more research. He deserved more effort than just a quickly thrown together and cut up reel. This man was the last great showing of European chivalry, as this time was very turbulent for imperial and monarchical ruled societies. You began to see the fall of empires, and monarchies would no longer hold as much power as they used to, and would begin to collapse into other societies, other nations, as we would see with the Russian Empire. He remained very steadfast in everything he did, refusing to go to war with Germany until they invaded, refusing to even find an ally. While he did strengthen ties, he did not out and out sign an alliance with the British until he was forced to. Even when he was invaded, he lost 95% of his country and was literally pinned to a wall. He never gave up. He would not let the Germans have his country. He would not let the French or the British have his country either. And as I said, not allowing his troops to merge together with the other Entente forces. This war was not his fight, and he was very, very clear on that. All he cared about was his country and his countrymen, and he was going to die before he let both of those fall. This is a great story. Do your own research if you would. If I missed something, please leave a comment and let me know. I love this story, and we'll continue to do more and more research on it just because I enjoy it. Maybe not another video, but I simply enjoy it. If you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe for more history, lore, and the unexplored. Bye, guys.